Welcome to the stream of tonight. That's really low. Okay, that's a little bit better-ish. Adjusting the mic gains. Fun stuff, I know. So yeah, tonight we're doing something a little bit different. Rather than something like super DME related, we're actually going to be talking about... Oh, it's so big. The gorgeous Art and Arcana book. Which is the visual history of D&D, which is pretty cool, especially for someone like me who's really not super familiar with the history of D&D. The first version I ever played was the 4th edition, and I liked it because it was the first version I ever played, so I didn't really have any basis of comparison. And so, yeah, it was really interesting going through it, and you can see I put a bunch of tabbies of interesting things. It's a holdover from my grad school days. I frequently do that with any book that I have. I didn't mark this one up or really highlight it. Yeah. It said we are.
Oh, that's a really long delay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. I say it says that.
I freaked everybody out.
Okay. Anyways, so yeah, I didn't highlight or really write in the book because it's got that kind of glossy paper, and so that kind of paper makes it a little bit harder because if you highlight or write, sometimes it then also transfers over to other pages. So that deters me from doing that, but doesn't mean I didn't take copious notes because that's just who I am as a person. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about this book because I've seen a lot of people post about it. I've seen a lot of people asking questions about it. I didn't really know what to expect when I got it, so I thought it might be helpful for people to get a little bit of a rundown of the interesting tidbits I found in the book, as well as a sneak peek of some of the interesting artwork, of which there is a ton. There is seriously so much awesome artwork, and it's really cool to get to see the evolution of everything. So this one might be one of my favorites, but the evolution of the beholder just makes me happy. Like, look at that absolute unit right there. Like, these are just so cool to see the actual art style evolution through time. And, that it was really neat to see that some of these creatures have been around since the beginnings in 1975. So, we've had this beholder for 30 years in the game, which is really an interesting thing to be able to actually track how things have evolved over time, how they've changed, what they've done, and there's a lot of that. There are a lot of looks at, here's what it looks like in 1975, here's what it looks like now, here's what it looked like in 2014. And so that's really cool to be able to literally see a sort of visual history, which, duh, the name, and figure out what changed. And you can see the different eras of artwork that they did, the times when things were a little bit more, a little more cartoony, a little sillier, a little less, rah-rah demons. And so it was really interesting to see. One of the things that was really cool was to actually see some of the monsters and how they came about, not exactly from drawings, but from Gary Gygax's little plastic mutilations he would make of creatures. So those are pretty funny. Like the owl bear and the boulette, they both sort of, here's what, a drawing of an owl bear looks like, and here's the weird little monstrosity that he made, and that one's really dark so you can't see it, but the original drawings were basically drawings of these weird little plastic amalgamations that he had made of little plastic creatures he'd gotten from, random stores. one of the things that I did really enjoy getting to look at was the different old character sheets. So this was the original character sheet. As you can see, there's a lot that's still the same and a lot that's changed. So it's really interesting to get to see the evolution of basically how the game is played and who the game is made for. Because starting out, it was more of it was inspired by war games and all of those sorts of miniature type of games. And so it had a very distinct audience to start with, and as it expanded outwards, it became the different editions became ways to try and reach new audiences and to bring in new blood, so to speak. And so different things changed and simplified and in some cases complicated. And so that was really interesting to get to watch. One of the things I found really fun was a discussion of the, I don't know a lot about D&D. I wasn't involved in it most of my younger years. Like I said, 4th edition was my first. Yeah, I think I had seen some of the 3-5 books in, stores occasionally, but I didn't really, the town I grew up in didn't really have comic book shops. And so there weren't really stores where those just would have been. And so, I watched the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon where they're all in, the weird little secondary world and everything's weird. Oh, I do have to show this picture because this is just, the bestest picture in the whole book. This is a man and his, camera. No. Camera is opposite of how I think, but it's a man giving roses to a beautiful beholder. And it makes me really happy. Because it's silly. But there's a bunch of stuff like that. There's a bunch of sort of little in-jokes and little hidden things in the artwork that they point out. Things that are holdovers from the company's original days as being run through TSR before Wizards bought them out. But yeah, one of the more interesting things that I had heard about Dungeons and Dragons, even before I ever started playing it, was the whole satanic panic thing. The town that I grew up in was really religious, and so I definitely remember hearing stuff about that in schools. And it was interesting seeing sort of the, origin story. Sounds a little bit supervillain-esque. But the story of how the satanic panic actually kind of started and kicked off, and it all started in 1979 when a Michigan State student went missing. And his parents brought in a questionable detective who decided to investigate this missing student. And after learning that the guy's name was James Dallas Egbert III, cool name, he played Dungeons and Dragons with people, and he would play them in these old abandoned tunnels near the school. And so this detective decided, after watching a game be played, that young Egbert had lost his sense of self and decided that he was his D&D character and had gone and wandered these tunnels to go and slay monsters. And the detective tried to go and get permission to go wander the tunnels, and the city was like, no, you're weird. Eventually he did get permission, but shocker, he wasn't there. And then what really cracked me up is that later on in that same year, Egbert showed up in Louisiana and was just like, I just couldn't handle college. And so he had just run away because of the pressures of college. It had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. It had nothing to do with anything. But that sort of was the spark of that original starting to show D&D in a dangerous light. And of course, this guy's arrival back and its missed connection to D&D wasn't really covered by the media very much, and so it sort of just slipped quietly away. And so that was sort of the start of the idea of Dungeons and Dragons being something a little bit more dangerous or a little more connected with bad things. And from there, a lot of it is Dungeons and Dragons. The company that they were, the original company, TSR, they did not handle this press necessarily well. And it definitely, like, they continued to sell well, they continued to do well, and, you know, no press is bad press, until it is. But, you know, like, literally the year later, they were putting out stuff like this, where it's, like, a dude on an altar being sacrificed to a spider demon. So, it was really interesting, because as it was being seen more and more as a corrupting influence, they were very much pushing these more dangerous and demonic-esque imagery. So that was pretty interesting to look. I work in like marketing and PR, and so it was interesting to look and just think, did they have a PR department? Like, what was happening there? So yeah, that was really a strange thing to see happening, because it did seem like they just sort of decided that you know, it was fine and that public opinion wouldn't matter. But as it continued to grow in popularity, it hit another big snag in 1982, when a I love the acronym and the name for the group. It's called We're Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Bad. And they actually went to, like, law enforcement groups to try and warn about the insidious occult phenomenon, including Satan worship. So, and then here's their beautiful pamphlet. We're bad. But yeah, that just sort of cracked me up with that's what they went with. You know, of all the things that they could go to. But yeah, that was starting in the early 80s. And again, at this point, they actually started to sort of be like, this seems like this could be a problem. And start adjusting to actually have guidelines. And requirements and things, and tried to soften the image a little bit more. And this is also when Dungeons and Dragons was beginning to hit, like, mainstream popularity. Like, I know a lot of people don't really think about Dungeons and Dragons as being mainstream until, like, now. But, I mean, it really was in the 70s and 80s. It showed up in a lot of TV shows. It showed up in a lot of references. You know, we got the TV show and eventually the horrible movie. Oh yeah, and then they so in the early 1980s, they decided, TSR decided that they were gonna let Mattel make an electronic game based on Dungeons and Dragons. And it was apparently super awful. It lacked directional buttons, so you had to toggle a cursor 3 to 4 times to make a turn. And it was just a complete disaster. And yeah. So yeah, after that, they were sort of like, maybe let's not do so much more of this right this second, because then we can't do a faithful adaptation. Which seems to be Dungeons and Dragons' main problems with trying to get into any sort of other media, is doing an actual adaptation of Dungeons and Dragons is hard, because it's a free-flowing game. I think probably the best way that they could do it is to actually take something like Curse of Strahd, some of their pre-written campaigns, Dragon Queen's Hoard, things like that, and turn those into movies, is probably the best way that they could go about it, I would think. So, maybe give that a try, wizards. Not that they seem to need that at the moment. But yeah, I mean, it's really easy to think that Dungeons and Dragons didn't really get popular until, nowadays. But it actually was doing fairly well through then. Oh yeah, and here's the lovely Dungeons and Dragons cartoon.
Remake that.
So that's kind of fun. It was very short-lived. And probably it didn't do, I would say it probably didn't do a whole lot for the actual brand, because I know I watched it and I didn't really realize that it was actually connected to some sort of a tabletop game. Yeah, it is. It's really funny thinking back on it and being like, I never really realized that this was a thing. That's a damn shame. Because I would have played the shit out of this in high school. I mean, I do now, so make up for lost time, yo.
It freaked out our parents even more.
But yeah, and then, so when we start getting into, the second edition? Yeah. When we start getting into, basically at the point that Gygax left the company is the point that we start getting, a lot of the things that I'm more familiar with. So we start getting Dritz and Spelljammer, and a lot of the other expansions and the different realms that we now know and love, so to speak. I'm really hoping that we'll have the return of some of those. I'd love to see a Spelljammer, just because sort of like a, flying magic ship is cool. I'm betting we're going to see an Eberron next year. I mean, the PDF's already out, so that's writing's pretty much on the wall. But I'm hoping maybe for like a Dark Sun or a Spelljammer, something like that, something different. It is really interesting looking at it and talking about sort of the competition between Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons, especially now that they're both under WotC, and we have more information of the two being tied together now. There's the new Ravenica D&D book that is it's Magic. So it's really neat to see the two of those actually start coming together. But yeah, here's Spelljammer with the cool ships. I'm going to outer space! So that's one that I really want to play because it sounds super awesome and I've not gotten the chance to ever play it. Yes, and then the arrival of Strahd when they were more... So yeah, the second edition seems like it was basically directly in response to a lot of the satanic panic going on. There was a lot of removal of mentions of demons, of sort of all of that kind of nonsense. There was a lot more, Strahd was sort of brought in as something that could be horrific while also troping on horror movies, so something familiar and less likely to, be called satanic worship. So we see the second edition is really where I start to recognize the game that we have now. The very first one, the advanced Dungeons and Dragons, looking through how that's played, it's a different game. There are some pieces of it still there, but it's very different. So yeah, it's interesting because the second edition is really where I'm first like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I see that. And so it's fun to be able to actually follow that evolution and to see sort of where all of these things start happening. But second edition is also, I think, where TSR sort of started to lose their way. They expanded too quickly. They jumped into a bunch of different types of media and spread themselves really thin, which led them to sort of a financial collapse, which is where the WotC deal came into play. So it's interesting, like, I, for some reason, had always thought that the WotC thing had happened much, much later, because the way some fans on the internet still talk about it, like, I was always just like, oh, that must have been like, okay, WotC got them, and then 5th edition happened, and that is not what happened. So, like I said, I'm completely ignorant of all D&D history, so for me, this was an excellent, like, you know, if I were taking a college course, this would be, like, 1101. Oh yeah, the camera did shift out of focus, weird. Okay, maybe that did it. Yeah, it has a hard time going from book to me. But yeah, so if this were a class, this would be an excellent 1101 textbook, because it really does give you a very wide overview. And I feel like the first 2 chapters are very, very, very in-depth. And then as you start getting to, like, the 3 and 3, 5, and 4, the chapters start getting a little bit shorter, which is fine because there's a lot more artwork to cover and there's a lot less explaining that has to be done. At the beginning, we have to be introduced to everybody who is involved in the creation, the introduction of what D&D is, how it started, where it came from. And so all of that lends itself to being a lot longer than some of the other chapters. So yeah, it's definitely a lot top heavy, I would say. I really wanted some more information, especially about the merger. Like the TSR WotC buyout is really, it's covered in basically a paragraph. And I know that that's not all of history. Like, I want to know what happened, where, you know, I want all the nitty-gritty details of, you know, what did this mean for the TSR employees? What did it mean for where they work? How did the leadership transition? What immediate changes happened? Those sorts of things. But that's just because I'm a nerd. So I wanted those details, and they weren't there, and I was sad. And they provide a little bit of those in the later chapters, but for me it felt very fragmented in how they did that, and that they split it in half. So it's basically one chapter ends and is like, oh hey, WotC bought them. And then it's like, oh hey, yeah, WotC bought them, and then they were here. Boop. And now it's 3rd edition. And so this book, I would say that at the end of the day, this book is absolutely, it is about Dungeons and Dragons. It's not about the companies themselves, except for the first part it is. So it almost shifts at the point that we hit, like, 2nd and 3rd edition, is it shifts from being about TSR and the people to entirely focused on the game. And I think that that's what kind of threw me, is it took a bit for me to adjust to that change and focus. Which isn't to say that the game isn't, you know, front and center fairly regularly at the beginning, but it definitely is a lot more about the company. We hear about, you know, Gygax's kids and their friends being brought in to help with artwork. We get a lot of details that maybe we don't otherwise need in a book about the history of the game itself. Though with a company that has like a 30-year history, that's got to be so much stuff to try and suss through and figure out what goes in and what doesn't. I think they did a good job. But yeah, now that I think about it, I think that's the issue that I've had with the Switch. Because it does feel very much like the book is split in half, and you get the, here's TSR, and here's where we're only going to talk about the actual physical game and not the company anymore. So, you know, a little bit of a bumpy transition in part, let's say section 5, which they call Big B's Interposing Hand. All the chapters have weird little cutesy D&D type themed names, which I thought was a cute detail. And then they also include like the description of that spell. But, oh yeah, and then we finally, with 3rd edition, is when we have Like, so I always thought that, 4th edition was my first ever introduction to D&D, but that's not true. Because I was obsessed with Baldur's Gate and these games as a kid. I don't know where my copy of Baldur's Gate 1 is, but I have it and I love it. So yeah, that was my first thing in there. And again, didn't really realize it was connected to a tabletop game. Didn't know tabletop games were a thing till college. Which, probably says a lot more about the city that I grew up in than anything else. But yeah, 3rd edition, it was really interesting reading about 3 and 3.5 because so many people that I play with rave about how great 3.5 was and that it was the best and yada yada yada. And, it's fine. Everyone can have your favorites. That's fine. It's, there are things I like about 4 and things I like about 5. So everyone's got their favorites. But what I liked is that it looks like, so with 3rd edition, they got rid of a lot of the stipulations that existed. So now you could have a wider variety of classes mixed with different race options. So that's kind of fun. What did they say?
Like dwarves couldn't go past level 9.
Yeah. But basically that this was a way to make it more open. Yeah. This new combination sent a strong social message. This game is for everyone and you can be whoever you want to be. And so I think that is sort of where D&D starts to really find its message in that. Because I would say that that's probably one of D&D's core messages, that you can be whatever you want to be. In a multitude of ways. And so I think that 3 is where it really started sort of finding its footing as a societal type of game. And as a way for more people to be able to see themselves in the game as well. So it's really interesting to see that at the point that Wizard got it, its messaging started to get a little bit more focused on bringing in outside people who were not already a part of the gaming community. They clearly still had a bunch of other stuff to go before. It seems like 5th edition has more picked up a bunch of people who've never played before. And a lot of that is through the internet and also because they rule simplification that they've done for 5e. So it's nice to see that idea is still there and still strong. And just reading through it, you can see a lot of the 3 and 3.5's ideas in what ultimately became 5th edition. But yeah, the 3.5 manuals are the ones that I saw in stores for a long time, and I'd occasionally pick up and look through, and then would have absolutely no idea what it meant, and then I just put it down. Because it was for me, it was sort of hard to figure out what it actually was with no concept of what a tabletop game was. I think we tried to play once in college with some friends, and none of us had ever played before, and none of us knew what we were doing, and it fizzled out after the very first game. Because we spent the vast majority of the game looking at the books like, what the fuck do we do now? And that didn't, make for a really compellingly good time. Shocking. I know. But yeah, so it's fun. And then also 3.5 is when one of my favorites came out, which is Eberron, which we talked about a little bit earlier. I love Eberron. I'm super excited about an Eberron book coming next year, hopefully, because I want it in my hand and not just on my PDFs. Yay! So, what I thought was really interesting about 4E is, you always wonder about what triggered these changes. And 4E was, again, another attempt to bring in non-gamers. And what this says is that it talked about how 4E was an attempt to directly compete with MMOs. So they tried to make the way that 4E worked similar to how, like, an MMO game would work, so that would translate for people. Which I thought was really interesting, because I would not have said that about 4E at all. So, cool story, bro. for me, I don't think that translated. But that is what ultimately triggered it, is that they wanted to try and reach that audience. And I love it because they have ads. They're really dark, so the camera won't pick them up, so I won't even bother. But it says, if you're going to sit in your basement pretending to be an elf, you should at least have some friends over to help. And I love that so much. I'm like, yes, whoever wrote that ad, A+ to you. Good job. That's funny. Whoever designed that ad, like, D-. It's horrible. It looks awful. It's way too dark and the font is awful. Do better. But the copy A+. And they tried to do some, holdovers and talkbacks to what some of the original ones were as well. So it's just kind of, but yeah, it seems like overall 4E was kind of it was a sort of knee-jerk reaction to the market changing. And so it made a lot of problems because it didn't really hold to people who played 3 and 3.5 did not come to 4. New people maybe came to 4, but there was a disconnect. It wasn't a game that a lot of people were wanting to dive into. And so that knee-jerk reaction kind of didn't necessarily work for them. Which ultimately is what led to 5e, where they made a pretty dang solid attempt at getting as many people's feedback as possible. They said almost 200,000 people ended up providing feedback because they went all over. They went to conventions, they reached out to groups, people did play testing. The people working on 5e played every single edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So for 5th, they took their time and I like 5e. I think they did a really good job. There are some things that I still liked about 4 that I kind of wish had come over. It's silly, but I really liked the actual descriptions that came with the attacks. I liked being able to be like, oh, and now I'm going to cast Bloodwing, and, millions of bats made of blood fly from me to you, and fa-ha-ha! But, I suppose that's what my own imagination is for. How dare I have to think with my own brain? But yeah, I feel like I've just sort of rambled more about D&D than much of anything else, but yeah, overall, this is an excellent look at the origins of Dungeons and Dragons, whether you're like me and you're a complete neophyte who knows nothing, or whether you're an old hat who is very familiar with D&D. I think it's a really cool starting point. And it's the most in-depth book that I've seen about the history of it. And I mean, it pretty much stops with 5th edition. It's a pretty much like, hey, 5th edition happened, and then Critical Role and Dwarven Forge, bye! And so it's fun. The one thing I did see interesting is that with 5th edition is when they started getting a little bit clever with how they were selling monster manuals in particular, with these whole, like, Mordenkainen's Tome, and all of these is by giving the monsters stories, it makes them more compelling, and it makes DMs more likely to buy those books. I love Dungeons and Dragons, but that's an absolutely brilliant and clever marketing ploy to sell more books, and good job, it worked. And then just because I have to, here's the evolution of Strahd.
What happened in 2006, man?
Strahd's had some tough time.
06 Strahd was on meth, man.
But yeah, that one you can really see the Dracula inspirations of the movies.
And then the Strahd we all know and love, mostly me.
Yep. Oh, good. The glare is blocking the horrible monstrosity Strahd.
That's fine. Nobody needs to look at him anyways.
But yeah, there are a ton of sections like that where it actually goes over some of the most beloved monsters. So it's got a whole section on owlbears and ropers and dragons.
Did you do the derpy beholder?
I did.
Oh, okay. I was out of the room for that one.
Yes, Strahd is clearly modeled on Perkins. He did make a very, very lovely Strahd.
Very lovely, if not slightly pudgy Strahd.
Oh, don't be mean. And then Felicia Day tripped over a couch. And it was great. But
that
yeah.
whole episode's a gift. That whole fucking episode is a gift.
So yeah, overall thoughts. I think the book is super awesome. If you have a Dungeons and Dragons fan who also likes history and reading or any sort of research, this is a great book for them. If you have someone who is a completionist, great book for them. If you have someone who just likes to play D&D, not a great book for them. There's not a lot in here that's going to help people who just want to play. This is first and foremost, it's a history book. It's got a lot of pretty pictures. It's really nice to look at, but it is first and foremost a history book. So if you have people who they love playing Dungeons and Dragons, but they don't really give a shit about the, how the bacon gets made, so to speak, this is not the book for them. It's really heavy. It's thick.
2 C's.
And this is just the normal edition. There's like a super fancy, super pretty, extra fancy edition that I really like as well. That I didn't want to spend all that money for. And also be careful if you order this off of Amazon or another online retailer. A lot of people had issues with how it was shipped. Which isn't a problem with books in general that you get on Amazon, is a lot of times they are just put in a box with some air cushions, and so it gets absolutely beat to hell before it ever gets to you. And so a lot of people have been reporting issues with damaged books. This one made it through fine. But yeah, a lot of people had a lot of problems actually getting a not damaged copy. Well, actually, now that I look at it a little close, like the pretty shiny print on the art and Arcana part is actually pretty scuffed up on mine. And so just, be aware of that. Try and order it through your local comic book store, or you actually you can just get this through your local bookstore as well. If you got an indie bookstore or even like a Barnes & Noble, you can order it through them. And they hopefully will be able to get that to you in a safer manner. So just a heads up, I know Amazon can be really convenient and helpful, but...
Support your local stores!
Yeah, but...
Shop local.
Yeah, especially with books. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff happening with Amazon and books right now, that a lot of their shipping policies and things are changing, which I won't even get into because that's completely unrelated to Dungeons & Dragons and not for this channel. So...
Information for me.
Yes, that's my personal information. You didn't hear it from me, internet. Shh. But yeah, this is a really cool book to actually look at the origins of Dungeons and Dragons, where it came from, where it's going, what all it's been through. I didn't realize Dungeons and Dragons was over 30 years old. So that's pretty cool, because a lot of companies don't make it that long. Especially companies doing these sorts of things. So, but yeah, if nobody has any questions, then I guess I will leave it with, my recommendation is if you have friends curious about the history of or behind the scenes of Dungeons and Dragons, it's a great book. If you just have people who like to play, it's not a great book for your DM. They're not going to be able to run jack shit from this. So yeah.
No plans.
It's just me talking about soup and how it's easy.
That's okay. But yeah, so that's
Why would it be rude to soup like that and say it's easy?
But yeah, I'm not sure if
Because it is.
it'll show up or not. But yeah, you can't really see it on here. But there are scuff marks on the shinies in the various parts. It doesn't show up very well. because that camera is not really high quality, but
It's high quality for us.
it's the highest quality we got, baby. But yeah, so that's it for tonight. We will be back on Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, where the Wild Hunt Festival will continue in River of Turicel. Probably in a significantly different tone than last game, with the Rock'em Sock'em robot fights and pig wrestling.
Still haven't come up with a name for that pig.
You gotta come up with a name for that pig.
I won't be here next game.
Oh, that's right. Damn it. Now I gotta redo everything. God damn it, Carolyn. Oh.
Clearly, Brian's next question is, what did she name the pig?
Yeah, we don't have a name for the pig yet. Sorry.
It's probably gonna be something kind of lame, but Badger's not creative.
But yeah, so that's it. Overall, I hate giving actual numbers to books because it just depends on who you are and what you enjoy reading. For me personally, I would probably give this like a 7.5 out of 10. I liked it. I don't know what to do with it now that I've read it.
Beat somebody with it.
Cause it big.
It's thick.
And I like it, but my bookcases are full. So I gotta figure out what to do with it. But I have a bunch of people who want to borrow it, so I probably will let them borrow it and then probably never see it again, because that's what always happens with books that you let people borrow. But they're my neighbors, so I know where they live. Hi, Tony and Christy, if you're watching this. But yeah, it's good. I enjoyed it. I got a lot of information about it that I had no idea about Dungeons and Dragons. And a lot more people involved than Gygax. That's the only name that I had ever heard, but there are a bunch of other people who deserve a lot of credit for Dungeons and Dragons birth. Like Arneson, I can't think of his first name now, but he deserves a lot of credit for the work that was done as well. Dave Arneson.
We're discussing pig names.
I know, you're discussing pig names and distracting. Oh, and then one thing that cracked me up is Gygax suggested that a good dungeon has no less than a dozen levels and 3 floors, which just is like so much. It's just like so much.
Nobody wants to crawl through a dungeon, Gygax.
There are dungeon crawlers out there who will fight you on that one.
They
Yeah.
can come. Actually, no, I don't want to talk.
Don't say that on the internet.
But yeah, it was really interesting to see that and to read about how the first book came into existence. That was probably one of the more interesting, is right at the beginning, and you see about all of the stuff that they had to go through to actually get the first one to print is really amazing at what they went through and all the people who worked together to make that happen. But yeah, it's really fun. It's a really good introductory to the history of Dungeons and Dragons. I feel a little less ignorant now when people talk about 3 and 3.5 and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I always wondered, well, where the hell was first edition? Ha ha ha. That's Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I guess it's technically the original, and then we got Advanced, and then just use numbers, people. Just use numbers. But yeah, so that's my rambly review of Art and Arcana. That's all I got for tonight. Again, we'll be back at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sunday for a 2-person River of Turicel that I gotta reevaluate what I'm doing now. And
At least you have a week to plan. No,
I do not have a week to plan. It is Wednesday.
you have half a week.
And I will see you all again. I have no idea who's doing DM chats next week. You may see me again. Don't know. So, have a good night, Internet. And go check out...
Naming the pig.
Yeah, I mean, I would be... Brian, if you want to run, a dungeon-y, crawly game, I would be game to try it, because I've never actually done a dungeon crawl game. Where, a Tomb of Annihilation type of thing.
Could be fun.
So that could be interesting. Though I get attached to my character, so them constantly dying would be sad. But if I went into it knowing they were constantly dying, I would be down for that maybe. and then just use the D&D Beyond random character generator so I can't get attached. Which is a lie, because I can get attached to anything. But yeah, if you wanna do that at some point, Brian, we'll work that out.
Oh, Brian apparently is a Marshmallow DM too.
Oh, we should. I actually thought about running Tomb of Annihilation just so that I could get over my Marshmallow DM-ness and just start murdering folk.
Well, anyways, this is Should Junior. He comes to avenge
So we will see if we can maybe sort that out. Again, for next month, since it's the holidays, things are going to be a little bit weird. I know we're not having Turi Cell on the 23rd. I think we're still up in the air on Cyril and what we're doing. So we'll figure it out, and as soon as we do, we'll let you know. We should know probably by next Cyril game what we doing. But yeah, it's the holidays, so people's schedules are a little bit whack. Anyways, this has been the longest outro in the history of outros. And I'm gonna actually turn this off now. So, goodbye, Internet.
Bye.
We will see you Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
I love you.